Okay, so I'd like to introduce you now to the Conscience Box. The Conscience Box is a model that I've created, and forgive me, I'm not claiming any great significance in that at all. I've got an MBA, so a 4-box model is something that I'm very, very familiar with, and something that all you do on an MBA is produce 4-box models. However, it seemed to me that, again, going back to the sense that we overcomplicate everything, in overcomplicating everything, we also, to a certain extent, miss out on some of the essential elements in the process that would give us much greater clarity as to why we're doing things, would help us be able to communicate to our staff, our colleagues, our peers, our suppliers, why we're doing things. And this can work equally in the family, at home, on the sports pitch, wherever it happens to be. This idea of the Conscience Box, about thinking about when you take an action or when you make a decision, why are you really making that decision? And what is the impact of that decision on the people around you? And is it therefore an honest decision? Is it in the best interests of the people you're representing, be that your company, your sports team, your family, whomsoever it may be? Or actually, is it potentially going to do damage? Is it short-term in its outlook? And is it self-interested? Or is it long-term in its outlook and generally focused on other people? And this comes back to the whole premise in my introduction that everything I'm talking about is about how you engage people, how you take advantage of the people around you, in the sense that you understand that they are just as important and just as significant as anybody else in this world. It's a very idealistic position. I absolutely accept that. But it seems to me that in terms of, if life is about leaving the planet in a more civilized state than when you joined it, then this is a way, I think, of thinking about it. And if you think about everybody as human beings, they are therefore exactly the same as you are, and they deserve respect, and they deserve to be treated well. They deserve to be treated exactly the same way you would wish to be treated, not necessarily how you have been treated, but how you would wish to be treated. And I say that because certainly for me now, I'm in my 60s, what's happened over the last 60 years, been a massive shift, a massive social and cultural shift. The strange time of the 70s, particularly the political era in the 70s with massive strikes, 3-day weeks, etc. And then we went into the Thatcherite years of the 80s and into the early 90s, which saw a radical change in the landscape, certainly in the UK and actually across the whole of the world. But it became very, very capitalistic. It was very much dog eat dog. It was, what can I do? And it doesn't really matter whom I trample upon whilst I am doing that. It was very self-orientated. It was about making as much money as you possibly could. And whilst I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't be looking to make money, what I am suggesting is there are ways and ways of making money. But the 80s and the 90s were very capitalist, very dog-eat-dog. The banks were running away with the amounts of money that they were being able to make, merchant bankers. There was this sort of stereotype of merchant bankers rolling out from their places of work at whatever time it may be, drinking champagne, spending ridiculous amounts of money on bottles of champagne and doing various other activities which we may not like to comment on. But a very bizarre reality. But for them, it was fantastic. For a lot of other people, there was a lot of hardship. But it didn't matter, because as long as you were at the top of your tree and you were making the money, everybody else was sort of inconsequential. And if you think about that from a mental health point of view, that's not actually a very healthy perspective to have in your life. Because, at the back of your mind, I suggest, and please, I am not a psychologist. I can't say that this is true for everybody, but it links into emotional intelligence. But, when you're doing something that it just doesn't quite feel right, there is that sense of disquiet in yourself. That's part of what this whole Conscience Box piece is about. And then we came into the noughties and the millennials and the Gen Zers, now the more recent workforce. They have a different expectation of life, and actually they want to be treated in a way that was different to the way that people were treated in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. And therefore it seems to me that we've been lacking this sort of fundamental perspective on why we do what we do, why we make the decisions we make, why we take the actions that we take, and challenging us to have a consideration as to the consequence of what that's going to do for everybody else impacted by it. So I built this very simple model called the conscience box. So the conscience box has an X and a Y axis, or it's a 4x4 box, as you can see, 4x4 model, as you can see here. And along the X axis at the bottom, it's saying, is the decision that you are making short-term and self-interested, or is it long-term and with a focus on the benefits accruing to the other people it's going to impact? And then on the y-axis, we have a passive and an active engagement in that decision making. So are you just sitting back and letting it happen, or are you actively out there leading the decision making, leading the debate, trying to change the way that things are done? And if it's over here, it's in a very, very positive way, and if it's over here, it's in a very, very negative way. And you can run any decision you make through this model. From very simply, shall I go out this evening? Well, if I go out this evening, what impact is that going to have on my partner or my children or the people I'm going to meet with? Or if I don't go out this evening, what impact is that going to have? And is my reason for going out a genuine and honest, a mature reason that actually doesn't do any harm to anybody? In other words, is it over here? Or actually, are people going to suffer as a result of that? You know, it could be your children, it could be your partner, who knows what it could be your work, because you're not actually doing the work that you should be doing, or that you might need to do that evening, so it's going to impact other people tomorrow when you haven't done this work. Now that's at a very, very micro scale. If we build that out into a more macro scale, let's look at some of the decisions that the government make. You know, when the government make a decision, for instance, to raise taxes, is that short-term self-interest, or is that long-term and others' interest? And you know, you could argue that it is long-term and others' interest in the sense that we have to raise taxes because we need more money to pay for the services. But one of the things that a lot of those kinds of decisions bake in is this law of unintended consequences. So if I do this, have I considered all of the implications to everybody else? And if I haven't, I really, really need to. Otherwise, there may well be an unintended consequence. So I raise tax because I need to generate more revenue as a government to deliver better services, but then these 3 million people fall into food poverty or something similar, and actually the draw on the existing tax take is even bigger. So although you may be looking at increasing taxes, you may find that there are more people now relying on the tax take, and actually the overall benefit is negligible, non-existent, and possibly far, far worse. But I hope you can sort of see that the way that the conscience box makes. And so I've given each of these 4 boxes a name. And in the very, very best case, you are a prophet, in that you are actively looking to make decisions and to take actions that are long-term in benefit and have the interest and the focus on other people. The focus on other people. Now, that's not to say that you as an individual do not benefit from it, but it is more like a selfless decision or a selfless action you are taking from which benefit will accrue to you. So it could be, for instance, that you are, let's say you are running a business, and rather than taking your £100,000 pay rise, you take a £10,000 pay rise. But that then gives you £90,000, which you can spread across other people in the organisation, for instance. Or if you run that up into a sort of a corporate level FTSE 100, rather than making £10 billion worth of profit, or even if you do take £10 billion worth of profit, you don't invest that profit in my bonus and the bonus of my senior management. You reinvest that in the business, or you give it to your shareholders, or you deploy it in other ways for the benefit of a lot of other people who aren't as lucky or as fortunate or as privileged as you. Then that is a much better, arguably, thing to be doing with your money. It's long term, it's focused on other people. You still accrue a benefit because you still get a pay rise, arguably. It's just not as big as it could be, or your company is still making loads of money, but you're not taking as much of it in profit as you could be. But the other benefit, of course, is the emotional benefit, which is far, far more important. And especially in this era now of mental health, I think it's something that we really should be considering. Are the things that I'm doing, do I feel comfortable? Does it make me feel good? Is it the right thing to be doing? And as long as it's the right thing to be doing, and you can justify that to your friends, to your partner, for instance, and they're a really great benchmark when you're thinking of doing something or taking an action, making a decision, run it past them and see what feedback you get from them. And if they're saying, does that really make sense? Well, then you should be challenging yourself. But the more often that you do this, the more baked in this will become. So if you're active and you're making great decisions that have long-term impact and are focused on others, you're a prophet. Equally, you could have that same emotional desire and that attitude and approach to the way that you're doing things, but you may not be quite so active in that. So I've called you a pilgrim. And please, these terms are not supposed to besmirch or denigrate anybody who identifies as any of these particularly. They're just words that I've chosen to use. And I hope that they convey a sense of what we're talking about. So pilgrim, passive, but supporting long-term, others-focused decision-making. And those are really the right decisions. I'd be a bit careful about that because I'm not necessarily saying any of this is wrong. I'm just saying that you need to understand why you're making these decisions, taking these actions, which of these boxes you sit in, and whether you can justify it to other people. And if you can, that may be great. If you can't, then you need to think again. Because over here, in the very, very worst case, if you are taking short-term decisions that are totally self-interested, I've called you a predator. And this is probably the box where we can identify lots and lots and lots of decisions that have been taken or actions that have been taken and people sitting in this box. The short-term, this is where all the scammers sit. It's short-term self-interest. How can I rip these people off? How can I take advantage of what society is doing around me? And I can piggyback that, and actually, rather than doing good, I can take the money off them. Scammers. So that was a good example, I think, of what a predator looks like. And then there are, of course, those people who are not so active in taking these short-term decisions with that self-interest, but nevertheless they are picking up the crumbs off the table, and I've called these people the parasites. So they are the acolytes of the scammers. They're the people in that food chain who manage to accrue benefit to themselves through short-term self-interest with no necessary regard to anybody else. And just look, very quickly we can get into quite an interesting ethical or moral debate about this. And indeed, the conscience box does work at that level as well. And in future, I may like to try to build this model out so that it can be more widely applied. But that is what the conscience box is about, and I will refer to it in some of these pieces. Are you making good, long-term decisions that benefit everybody else? They still benefit you, but they don't maximise the benefit to you in a sense that rather than taking a £100,000 pay rise, you only take a £10,000 pay rise. As a corporation, you've made £1 billion worth of profits, but you don't give that all back to the people in the company or the shareholders. You give them a proportion of that and spend the rest in supporting a lot of other people or doing great things. Or are you self-interested, making short-term decisions? Are you predatory or are you a parasite, which really only benefit you? And they only benefit you in the short term because they are not sustainable. And that's the last part of I suppose, this conscience box model, is the whole point about long-term and others focused is that they are sustainable. And as I'm sure you may well be aware, but you can tell, the world is changing and the world is going to have to change. So the opportunity for short-term self-interest decision-making is rapidly disappearing, because the planet is not going to hang around and tolerate some of the stuff that we're doing to it. And so we need to be thinking about longer term and others' interests. And when we talk about others, not only are we talking about people, we're now talking about the planet. So the whole fossil fuel debate could fit into this side of the conscience box. Why are we extracting more fossil fuels? Why are we burning more coal? Can we afford to be putting more carbon dioxide in the earth, in the atmosphere? Clearly the answer is no. So while I've very much focused on some very simple examples and focusing on money, pay or profit, I don't want to mislead you in the sense that the only way you can use the conscience box is with financial based considerations. This applies to anything, any decision that you might be making. So for instance, let's go back into the boardroom. Let's talk about plans for next year. Let's recruit a new finance manager. Okay. Great decision. Let's recruit. Let's understand why we're recruiting a finance manager. What impact is that going to have? Am I going to recruit my partner as the finance manager? What implications are there around that? nepotism or favoritism or bringing in the family. You can see where it goes, but it works at every level you can possibly think of. Let's say you're a smaller business and you've got a bit of a bank loan, and you decide, I'm going to go and buy a van now. Okay, maybe you need a van, maybe you don't need a van. Is it right to be buying that van? What are the other people in your business going to think when you go and spend the money on buying a van, when, for instance, they haven't got any IT equipment, for instance, or they're not paid very much, but you appear to be living it up? And sorry, I'm accentuating the negative, purely because the negative is easiest to understand in sense of the impact that it will have. But it works entirely the other way around as well. Where are the benefits from all these decisions I'm making? What decisions should we be making? Here's our organisation. It appears to be running particularly well. But we've got some profit, or we've got some money, or we've got the opportunity to invest. What should we be investing in? And so you can put all of those investment decisions through the conscience box, and let's move to a new office, let's expand into Europe, or let's get we're a small electricians, and we're running out of my house, and actually that's a bit of a pain in the arse. So let's take an office. Well, if we take an office, what are the implications? Is that sustainable? Is it long term? Has it got others' interest, or is it purely short term and self-interested? So it works both for the financial considerations, which I've majored on up to now, but it works across every decision that you make. Let's take it away from business completely. I mentioned the idea of, do I go out this evening? And I'm sorry, maybe a trite or a simple example, but let's just think of another example in exactly the same way. Should I go and pick my son up from football, or should I get somebody else to bring him back? It's a very simple decision. You probably don't think twice about it. But part of this thought process is, how comfortable am I about getting somebody else to pick up my son? Why am I making that decision? Is because I can't be bothered? Actually, but much easier to get somebody else to do it. Okay, maybe that's a justification in your own mind. But then, how is your son going to be thinking? Oh, Dad never comes, never picks me up. It's always Mrs. Smith down the road who ends up bringing me back, or whatever. If you see what I mean, there are always implications, and I'm just using the conscience box as a way to prick your conscience, to make you ask yourself the question, understand why you're making the decisions that you're making, and make sure that you can justify it. And the second thing I want to mention is this idea of sustainability. My point about sustainability is, especially with the millennials and the Gen Zers, this new way of working, the workforce want a different way of working. Setting aside the macro issue of the planet potentially giving up on us, but if you look at life cycles of companies that are very short term and make quick decisions, make a big buck, very, very often you find that those companies do not succeed in the long term, because they may make a lot of money today, but in making a lot of money, potentially they've damaged their reputation, or they've upset all of their staff, or they're not very well regarded. And there seems to be, historically, I don't have any statistical evidence of this, but historically you'll find that companies that don't have that longer term generosity in their decision making, whose integrity in what they are trying to do is perhaps somewhat questionable, typically they will fail. Whereas companies that take longer term decisions, that are prepared to compromise on maximizing the return that they can possibly gain financially, but actually they gain far more reputationally, and therefore from a brand perspective, by making much more balanced, much more reasonable, much more generous decisions, they survive into the future. So the sustainability, that's really where the sustainability part comes into all of this. So the conscience box is just a model I would suggest that you think about using when you're making any decision or taking any action. Understand the possible implications, positive and negative. And then, having gone through that conscious thought process, you can make the best decision for your business and ensure that it is ethical, it's honest, it's with great integrity, and it adds value to your brand, to your reputation, and internally to your culture.